In the summer of 2021, my husband Joseph and I bought our first house together. It's been nearly a year since then, and trauma healing certainly has its ups and downs. But overall, I'd really say I'm doing better. The other day, I made a Reddit account and I thought maybe my story would fit here. About a year ago, Joey and I were recently married. Although we'd been together nearly 6 years. We weren't high school sweethearts per se, but we had been close since sophomore year. He was kind and empathetic, truly a big softie. Maybe it was because of his own struggles as a trans kid in our small rural community, but the guy couldn't hurt a fly. After we graduated high school, Joey came to stay with my family, as it was safer for him at the time. I suppose it was during this time I began to fall for him. When I moved away for college, he came with me. And when I moved back to be closer to my family, he came back too. During this time, we started dating, and I realized he truly was the love of my life. All that to say, you could imagine the way I rejoiced when he asked me to marry him. And you could imagine my excitement when we found a quaint, comfortable, affordable house to buy. What you could not imagine are the horrors that made themselves at home there long before we did. The house was an hour outside of my hometown, sitting at the end of a winding, hilly, unnamed road. It was mostly a faded off-white color, but the accents of the place were a charming pale blue. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, and a small basement and attic for storage. It was a bit run down, with stains in odd places and floors that creaked at odd times. But to Joey and I, it only made the house feel more special. After all, it was our home. We were people with quirks, we thought. Why not have a house with quirks? In hindsight, I suppose this is where the first lesson of my story comes in. I've always been an anxious person. From a young age, I found monsters in shadows, strangers in the dark, unspeakable terrors in the face of uncertainty. No one saw more of this than Joe, who found he regularly needed to assist in calming my nerves. "No, dear," he'd assure, "your mother hasn't fallen ill. No, darling, that sound wasn't the start of a break-in. No, my love, you didn't forget to lock the doors. Do you want to go check them again?" Joey's patience should have earned him medals and awards as far as I'm concerned. The thing about anxiety is that it often feels like intuition. Oftentimes, we are told to trust our gut, but I've spent my entire life learning to ignore mine. So when my nerves kept me up past midnight on our first night sleeping in our new house, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. In hindsight, I suppose this was my first mistake. On that first night, I chose to wander through the house in an attempt to perhaps bore myself to sleep. Sliding on some slippers, I carefully made my way to the kitchen. I set the kettle on the stove, nothing calms a restless mind quite like chamomile tea, and let myself pace calmly as I waited for the water to boil. The room was cold and I felt my hair stand up on my arms as though it was desperately trying to escape my skin. I crossed my arms close to my chest in an attempt to stay warm and put the feeling out of my mind. With a bit of a shiver, I turned to continue my pacing around the room. It was at this point that my eyes landed on the faint square shape on the wall next to the hallway leading to my bedroom. Perhaps a safe, perhaps a cubby of some sort. Whatever it was had seemingly been covered by paint and wallpaper, sealing it away. In my sleep-deprived state, my mind could make nothing of value of the shape. My body, however, seemed to know something my mind had yet to catch on to. As I traced the square in the wall with my line of sight, my heart began to pound so loudly that I feared that the sound would wake Joe in the bedroom. My legs seemed to move on their own, slowly stepping closer to the wall, and as my hand reached out to touch it, my heart prepared to burst from my chest, my mind growing foggy with panic. The kettle began to sing. The loud, high squeal of the kettle snapped me so aggressively out of my panicked trance that I wondered briefly if I had dreamt the entire thing. With shaking hands, I poured my tea, forcing myself to make use of each deep breath technique I'd picked up over the years. All of a sudden, though, my nervousness had yet to subside. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. In an instant, I wanted nothing more than to doze off in the warmth of my bed and the soft comfort of Joey's arms. I walked back to my bedroom, set my cup of tea on the nightstand, and crawled into bed. As I closed my eyes, I decided to chalk the panic up to fatigue and being in a new environment. Sleep took me quickly into its grasp, and I didn't spare the square in the wall another thought. Perhaps this was my second mistake. In the weeks following that night, I nearly forgot about the entire event and the square in the wall. Between working and trying to adjust to the new house, I managed to keep my anxious mind mostly occupied. It wasn't until I started to have nightmares about the damn thing that I remembered its presence. They started out scattered and relatively manageable, this being about a month into living in the house. Every couple nights, a snake would slither out of the square-shaped hole in the wall, coiling around my neck until it snapped. A swarm of bees would use their stingers to nail me against the square spot. Each nightmare left me groggy and irritable the next day. I ended up taking my stress out on poor Joey. While this isn't a mistake in regards to my story, it certainly is in my overall life. I love Joey dearly and will always be eternally grateful for his patience with me. It wasn't long before the nightmares were coming every night. Spiders crawling from the wall, clowns and murderers bursting through it. A latch on the square opening to reveal the fiery eternal damnation of hell. It wasn't much longer before the nightmares progressed to night terrors. I'd wake up screaming, sweating, clinging to Joey and sobbing like a baby. Eventually, every evening consisted mostly of me crying. First, over the terror of falling asleep. Then again, after I'd wake up. I began to fall into a depression. I was constantly sleep deprived. My paranoia became so heightened that I hardly even left my room. A week of this went by, my symptoms only worsening. Joey took care of me as best he could, but after 22 days of this entire ordeal, he was no longer able to coddle me. Joey was scheduled to fly out to Europe with his brother in order to get a subcutaneous mastectomy, a masculinizing chest surgery. It was something he'd been waiting for his entire life. Top surgery waitlist had been hellish, but at long last, the time had come. Yet here I was, a nervous wreck, unable to leave my room for anything other than the toilet. It was at this point I realized I needed to get myself together. I'll admit, I was terrified to be without him. However, I knew I'd never forgive myself if I held him back like this. From deep down inside myself, I pulled forth all the mental strength I had. I was going to be alright, I assured both Joey and myself. On day 23 of this, nearly 2 months into living in the house, I got out of bed and cleaned. I caught up on work, I took care of myself. On day 24, I cooked lunch and dinner, and did all I could to be helpful around the house. Although my night terrors persisted, I forced myself up in the morning and all through the day. In the end, it paid off. Joe pushed to stay home, insisting he needed to take care of me. But I stood my ground. I was okay, I could handle myself. Eventually, he acquiesced, and I kissed him goodbye before we left for the airport. In spite of all of my performed confidence, I was still scared to be home without him. My fears only proved to be valid, when on the 25th night, I had the worst night terror yet. In this dream, I'd been unable to move or blink. I was sat on the floor in front of the wall, with the square only a foot away. In the dream, the square shape was made from thread sewn into the wall. Slowly but surely, the thread was pulled out, and a door swung open. Inside was a dark, damp, cube-shaped hole, filled with nothing but dust and mold. It reeked of blood and of mildew. Yet I was paralyzed, unable to even recoil from the smell. Then, slowly and deliberately, my body began to move toward it, as if some invisible force were pushing me. My limbs moved into the hole in the wall, followed by my hips, my torso, and my head. This hole was in no way big enough for me to fit in, and yet in I went. I heard my bones crunch and crack and snap as I pressed further and further into the wall, and right as I could hear the door about to close, trapping me there forever. I woke up. On the 26th night, the dream repeated. On the 27th night, the dream repeated. On the 28th night, 3 weeks after my first night terror, I suppose something snapped in me. I woke up screaming for the umpteenth time, from the same dream I had for 3 nights before. My mind felt dazed, my body felt tingly. Before I really knew what I was doing, I'd climbed out of bed and raced towards the kitchen, as if the gods themselves had plotted this. A full moon shone through the window, casting a perfect spotlight on the square shape in the wall. My mind felt on fire, my limbs sore with electricity. I banged my fist on the wall, clawed at it until my fingertips grew numb, searched and felt every angle for a latch or a knob, and then I saw it. A hammer, sitting still on the kitchen counter. The world seemed to move in slow motion as I walked towards the hammer. A part of me registered how heavy it was in my hand, how much damage it was capable of doing, and yet, as I stepped back towards the square that had been plaguing my mind for weeks, the logical part of my mind sank far, far down into my gut. I felt my hand raise. I felt the impact of the hammer against the wall. I felt it again and again and again. I saw dust settle. I saw the broken, jagged hole. And most importantly, I saw a plank of wood. The plank of wood to which the square outline in the wall belonged. I let the hammer fall to the floor beside me, sinking to my knees so as to be at eye level with the square, locking my fingers around the exposed corner of the wooden plank. I mustered up all the strength in my body and I pulled. This was my final mistake. The first thing I saw was an eye, wide and red, staring straight at me. After that was the arm, broken and severed at the elbow. Bone jutted out of it, poking the flesh of the cheek it pressed against. Then was the mouth, open, as though the head were still screaming, still breathing. Another arm showed from behind the head, the wrist bent to fit against it. A leg, which had clearly been flattened against the hard plank, seemed to frame the rest of the corpse. The knee was bent backward, and the ankle and foot pointed in a direction I felt in my soul it was not meant to. Dried caked blood streaked the pale grayed stretched skin, blending the cross from skin to muscle to exposed and jagged bone. The last thing I saw was the thread. Red and black thread stitched the limbs together, stretched skin, held eyes open, pinned the mouth wide and gaping like it was still yelling, still screaming, screaming a sound that ran warm blood frigid, ice cold, screaming for its life, screaming. I heard screaming. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up in a hospital bed a few days later, and I can't remember anything after that until even further down. My memories of the next month or so are spotty. At some point, Joey came back home. At some point, we left the house. At some point, I stopped crying. I just don't remember the details. But what I do remember was the sound of shrieking. The withered pale face pulled to a scream. And I do remember that even though I now realize that that scream erupted from my own throat, it was deeply surely and certainly not my own.